and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Today is Inauguration Day for Joe Biden, as he will be taking an oath to serve as the 46th President of the United States. But what lies beyond the inauguration spectacle are the domestic and international divisions that were made more pronounced by under the Donald Trump presidency. Now, can these divisions be overcome by the incoming Biden administration? Joining us to discuss this further from the U.S., we have Meredith Weiss. She's a professor of political science at the State University of New York at Albany. Meredith, good evening now, or good morning to you. Let's begin our conversation with the inauguration ceremony itself. Now, this year, because of COVID and because of security concerns, it will be held without the throngs of people and well-wishers as in tradition. But we also have Donald Trump, who is snubbing tradition by not attending his successor's inauguration. And the inauguration itself is taking place amid increased security after the violence at the Capitol building we saw just weeks ago. Meredith, maybe you can help strip back some of the spectacle behind this democratic transition and point us to what we should be focused on. What is significant at this moment?
Sure, and thanks for having me. So normally, Inauguration Day in Washington, D.C. is really festive, regardless of which side of the aisle one may be on in terms of their own partisan sentiment. The mall is filled with people wanting to see it, whether they support the person who's been elected or not, and businesses thrive and so forth. So D.C. right now is desolate. In fact, it's very inconvenient for people who live in the city because so many roads and major bridges and so forth are completely blocked off. Part of that is, as you note, COVID. The mayor of Washington, D.C. had already been asking before January 6th that residents and others please not come down to the mall to watch inauguration for fear of a super spreader event. But since the violence on the 6th, the whole circumstance has changed. So now the mall is closed. There'll be apparently about 500 VIPs in attendance, well spread out to avoid COVID spread, but that's it. But I think perhaps the ceremony last night most clearly signals the transition and what this inauguration can represent. And that was this really gorgeous spectacle broadcast, because people were not supposed to be there in person, of hundreds of thousands. Apparently, it sounded like about one flag for every two people in the U.S. who's died of COVID, so close to 200,000 flags, and 56 light beacons or pillars to represent the states and territories of the U.S. to memorialize those who have died so far to COVID in the U.S., which has had just a terrible bout with this pandemic. And that was, as many noted, the first time that the official U.S., the president or president-elect, has really commemorated all of those deaths. So I think that Biden is really trying to signal compassion and a greater attention to the needs of everyday Americans and just a more science-based, fact-based, and forward-looking approach than has been the norm, certainly in the last several weeks amidst all the racial violence and so forth of white nationalists, but really at least for the year of the pandemic and well before that as well.
Meredith, I mean, how do you weigh these very different spectacles? Today's inauguration, stage managed, you know, like you said, with those 200,000 flags, great expense has gone to create those symbols against the spontaneous violence and chaos that was the 6th of January's so-called Capitol insurrection. Is much of this an attempt to correct the way the world sees America, or how America sees itself? To what extent is this ceremony even going to be watched by Americans, and how important is it to their lives?
That's a great question. So I would correct one thing, which is to say that the violence on the 6th was not spontaneous. So for some who were involved, they probably did not expect to be storming the Capitol. But as is the case with what we term riots pretty much anywhere, there was planning. And so some of the recent arrests have been members of this so-called Oath Keepers, these military, police, and veterans who have formed this group of so-called patriots to essentially foment violence. So many are white nationalists, many are motivated perhaps also by other issues. But there was planning in the Capitol insurrection. So apart from that, I do think, actually, that there will be very substantial viewership of the inauguration. That I'm saying that based on, for instance, the very high, unusually high levels of viewership for the Democratic and Republican conventions, for instance. But I think that this is a ceremony that's stage managed for both domestic and international audiences, bearing in mind that the inauguration is always stage managed. It is always a moment of pomp and circumstance that is designed to signal the timbre of the new administration. And that's part of why Trump's discussion in his inaugural address of American carnage 4 years ago really caused some concerns as signaling the timbre for that incoming administration. So I think we'll see messages of reassurance and progress and hope and progressive values and so forth from Biden today, given the traditional role that the inauguration and especially the incoming president's address plays. I think, though, that you're right, that this stage-managed event bears a special significance given the really horrific images that were coming out of that very same spot at the Capitol just a couple weeks ago. And I do think it is an important moment to show that, look, the Capitol is back together. Those scaffolds that before had white nationalists climbing on them with guns and smoke bombs and so forth now will have an orderly progression of luminaries from the American political system. I think it also matters that, for instance, Biden kicked off the morning with a bipartisan trooping off to go to Mass, since he is a practicing Catholic. And so all of those things, yes, are symbolic and all of that, but I do think that they are carefully designed to help to reassure people that we are getting back on track. And I think those messages, yeah, of course, they're very important for international allies who may be really concerned by what they've been seeing in the U.S., but they're even more salient for domestic.
Well, okay, beyond the symbolism, though, Meredith, what will happen to the social divisions, the social cleavages that are so pronounced in the U.S. at the moment? I mean, we had earlier today Bridget Welsh, who said that just because Trumpism doesn't go away just because Trump is gone. And I'm wondering what happens to the U.S. now. It remains sharply divided. Biden is coming into a White House and having to deal with this hyper-partisanship, not just in Washington, but also in the rest of America.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. And so part of why Trumpism was allowed to thrive as it did was because the U.S. has serious problems with racism and white nationalism and all of these other pathologies that we've always had as a country and have never fully dealt with. I think, though, that some of the changes afoot may help to address that. So on the one hand, there's been a dramatic drop in false information. So one estimate I saw was that over 70% of the false information on Twitter about the elections had disappeared by just banning Trump from Twitter. So the fact that social media are finally taking more of a step to try to curb misinformation will help some of that. And it's not that not hearing false news makes people suddenly believe in racial equity, for instance, but it helps to diffuse some of the immediate tension by taking away a specific target, by making them realize, all right, no, there's a larger issue here, and that we do need to deal with. But some of the immediate
Meredith, sorry, can I interrupt you? Meredith, is it too early to talk about the successes of the Trump administration that some of his supporters point to, whether it's the economy or breakthroughs as they see it in the Middle East or even in pushback against China? Can we talk about Trump's successes?
I don't think we can right now talk about them because the Middle East I'll bracket that for now because there's just such clear divide over some of Trump's policies on the Middle East. But for instance, on China, yes, pushback, but at the same time, if the parting shot of declaring genocide lights a fire, then that's not really much of a success, right? So just pushing back with grandstanding doesn't really mean much in terms of trade deficits and so forth. We've yet to see what the actual impacts of Trump's policies are, especially in light of COVID. Economic gains are largely undone by COVID. So the incredibly poor handling of the pandemic has really unraveled what some of Trump's supporters might have otherwise seen as goals. Yes, the stock market is doing really well, but unemployment is rising again and so forth. So I do think in that sense that we need to give some time before we would evaluate more reasonably what his supporters might see as goals. Getting back to sorry, go on, yeah.
I'll just, on that note, one of the things that Trump did do was to engineer this conservative majority Supreme Court. I'm wondering, Meredith,
yes,
just how much will this Supreme Court likely curtail Biden's power? I mean, they've already shown to have an allergy towards climate reform, towards civil rights reform.
Right.
Will we see Biden have to use executive power to push through some big legislation?
There's a third option, which is legislation. So the executive order is really in lieu of legislation, and the courts have, one of the complaints on both sides is that the courts, the activist judges, whether they be conservative or liberal, are in lieu of legislation, where it's too difficult to legislate, for instance, marriage equality. You leave that to the courts instead, and that leaves an unstable situation. So hot-button issues like reproductive rights, for instance, what I suspect we'll see instead is, especially with, however slim a majority, a Democratic majority in both houses of Congress, we'll see a move to legislate into reality some of those policy goals rather than leaving it to the courts. And indeed, it's a fair argument that that's part of what the courts have been trying to get Congress to do, is instead of pushing hard decisions to the courts, to take the initiative themselves to try to legislate. So those will not be easy legislative matters, any of the really tricky things. But some of the climate decisions, for instance, I totally agree. I think the courts may push back. But if Biden, as planned, starts with executive orders starting today, and then Congress takes up more of those issues so that we're not just looking to regulation from executive orders, but supportive legislation through Congress, that may actually change the environment, change the timbre for policymaking, but also change the prevailing laws such that the court, right, the Supreme Court still does have the power of judicial review, as we've seen with Obamacare, for instance. But that's a different matter than leaving it to the courts to set policy, which has been the practice for quite some time now on a number of key issues.
Okay, Meredith,
last question, very quickly. Sorry.
Okay, we've got a quick question.
Yes. What do you think Americans want from the presidency, from this office, considering how widely distributed power is, in fact, in the U.S.?
That's such a hard question for all the reasons that Melissa laid out earlier about the really divided populace. So I mean, for those who support, and within each party, this is part of what makes this so hard to see. It's not just this polarization of those who do and don't like the fact that, Trump is out of office, which is, of course, the most visible division right now. But I think as we're past, for instance, the first 100 days and this new impeachment and so forth, I think what we'll see as being more keen are the divisions between both the Democratic Party flanks and the Republican Party's flanks. So whether we'll have a Trump versus a more centrist or moderate Republican division, and that party could really split over this division, and whether we'll see the progressive left versus the moderate center of the Democrats really split. So I don't know how that will fall out, but I think that those divisions really determine what people want of Biden as this center-left president. So I do think that those who voted for him want some quick executive action on issues like climate change and immigration and racial justice. And he is planning a whole series of executive orders for today to get the ball rolling. But in terms of how much they want a policy restart, that is such a partisan distinction that I think, again, both within and across parties will have really serious divides on how much they want this new administration to do and how much through the presidency versus through the Congress.
All right. Thank you so much, Meredith, for joining us from the U.S. Happy Inauguration Day to all celebrating in the U.S. Thanks for joining us on the show. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more on Consider This. Stay tuned. Hello, we'll be right back with more on Consider This. Stay tuned. Hello, we'll be right back with more on Hi, thanks for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our look at the incoming Biden administration as he is sworn in as the 46th President of the United States today, taking helm of a nation racked by political division and also the twin crises of COVID-19 and an economic downturn. Joining us now from the US, we have John Pang. He's a senior fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College in New York. John, good evening. The American media and some pundits have been using what we would say maybe some quasi-religious language to describe this day, that it has symbolic value, that it's a new dawn, it's a new era, the majesty of it. How much does the actual ceremony of the inauguration mean to ordinary Americans? And what would you say for us observers on the outside, what should we be looking at in terms of its significance?
I like that you begin with talking about the sort of religious language, because that's one of the key elements to understand about U.S. politics and why it remains so divided and contentious. This is, of course, overblown language, just as the description of the rioters or protesters, if you will, on January 6th, as a sort of mortal threat, sort of coup, as coup plotters and as terrorists and so on is overblown. So, these things are, this is part of the sort of rhetoric of sacralization of politics and of kind of raising the stakes, making them almost sort of eschatological, sort of this is good versus evil, this is new era. This is all, in my view, worrying stuff, So
John,
I don't think, I think there's reason to be optimistic on reasonable points, but this sort of religious language is part of to me, part of what's disturbing about what's going on.
Yeah, on that score, looking at Donald Trump leaving, there's a lot of focus, I think, in the mainstream media in the U.S., at least as we get through CNN and such, on his petulance and on his personality as a person who doesn't care much for tradition and so on and so forth. But, what do you think, sort of peeling away some of this rhetoric, the anti-Trump vilification of Trump kind of rhetoric? What do you see happening in this attitude between Trump on this day?
The attitude between Trump and
the attitude that Trump has towards this day, and what constituency is he speaking to as he refuses or rejects these traditions?
He appeals to a very large constituency, right? So, of course, almost half of America voted for him. Of course, not all of those are his sort of hardcore base, but we have about 20 to 30% of the population who are highly animated by Trump. Yes, he was his language was unrestrained and offensive, but language aside, he represents something, or even sort of with that language, with that sort of convention-defying sort of stance, he stood for a rather serious populist discontent. So, and that's an issue that won't go away over the next 4 years.
Well, I want to ask John what you think Trump's legacy will be in a domestic sense. How do you think Americans will remember Donald Trump? And I'm wondering whether it is too soon to be thinking about what Trump has done. And some, depending on where you're coming from, may be seen as some of his successes during his 4 years.
Let's begin with the easy part, the successes. Well, he hasn't. He's the first president in a long time not to have started a new war. So these are negative ones, right? He hasn't stopped any of the sort of the continuing and perpetual wars of the U.S. And the U.S. has been in a state of a constant, more or less constant war since the war on terror. And in fact, in the entire history of the U.S., you have only 70. It's harder to find those years when it hasn't been at war, maybe 17 or 21 years. But that you can sort of attribute to Trump. He has, but he will be remembered as one of the worst presidents we've ever had. He is not, objectively speaking, on certain other scores. There are others who have done perhaps even more damage. But the damage to the U.S. Rhetoric, the damage to our perceptions of the U.S. around the world is grave. This is, in my view, not simply damage. This is really, Trump is not the disease. He's a symptom of and it should be described. So there's a tendency to want to just forget and scapegoat and put it all on him. But what he reveals with this sort of really sort of offensive and displaced style is something that needs to be looked at. And I don't think the country is doing that yet. Perhaps too
John,
early.
if we could look at the incoming Biden administration, the many headlines, even before he takes the presidency officially, that seems to be pushing the rhetoric of inclusion. Many first women, people of color, transgender. I think Assistant Secretary of Health, so on and so forth. Is this a continuation of the Obama administration style of governance?
Well, it's very much a restorationist, an Obama restorationist government, right? Build back better. But and by that, they mean trying to go back to 2016. So, and included in that, as you point out, is this a sort of cultural, racial tokenism, of appointing lots of black and brown people to high places, and women. Those are good things. Those are important things and necessary things. But if the Obama administration is anything to go by, that's all you're going to get. So under Obama, there was a sort of, again, a massive transfer of wealth to the already wealthy, and the prosecution of wars, of even more wars, drone killings, assassinations, and so on. So Obama
Well, you're right, John. I mean, socially, the world has changed in the past 4 years that Biden has left the vice president's office. But also the superpower dynamics, the geopolitical dynamics has changed as well. Where do you see the biggest foreign challenges to Biden's administration coming from? Is it going to come from Russia? Is it going to come from China or the Middle East? Where do you see that the dynamics of where the U.S. will play on the world stage?
So there is the answer to this is there's one is where I see the greatest challenges, and then where the U.S. sees the greatest the Biden administration will. The most to start with the positive again, perhaps the most viable kind of attempt to return to status quo ante, to where things were when the Obama administration left them, would be with Iran. So there's a commitment to try to rejoin the nuclear disarmament, the sort of JCPOA, the nuclear limitation treaty with Iran. But nevertheless, you're right. Is it possible to go back? The world has changed a lot, and Iran may not be taking that position, may not be as ready this time, may not be as willing. But the greatest threat, sort of being hyped by the administration, is without question China, followed closely by Russia. So there's a huge displacement of threat outwards into China and Russia. And I think the difference with this administration is that they will be able to work better with allies in sort of Europe and in Asia to form coalitions against China and Russia. And this is what, going back to our region, to Southeast Asia, those will be the issues.
Right.
Yes. John, should we place too much hope on an America that's going to be an activist one, that's going to be involved in democracy and spreading democracy around the world? All that, is that something of the past? Will we see a return, an attempt to do that again with the Biden administration? I'm actually not so keen on the U.S. returning to a kind of liberal interventionist policy, if that's what you mean. So in the Obama and Clinton administrations, you had the sort of Democrat equivalent of the neocons. You had sort of liberal neocons who created a doctrine for intervention, for so-called humanitarian and human rights intervention around the world. So I worry when U.S. Foreign policy is dictated by so-called democracy and human rights. Not that these are not really important principles, but these are principles that have been securitized and weaponized. So the massive hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy that people note, especially this year, it comes down to that. It comes down to the application of these principles.
Right.
Yeah. So
John,
I don't know if there will be a return. We have some of the personnel from the Obama administration. It is a kind of semi-reboot of the Obama foreign policy.
Right. John, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight.
Yes.
We really appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.